So, hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jeff Schullenberger, and this is another episode of Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors. This week I'm joined by Chris Cutrone, who has written several things for us, but most recently has written about Donald Trump's proposal to buy and annex Greenland, and more broadly his interest in various territories in the hemisphere, including Canada, the Panama Canal. And so, Chris, this piece came out about a week ago. It did provoke quite a bit of controversy, some denunciations. So have you been canceled as a result of this? I understood there was some effort to sort of drive you out of an organization you're involved with. So,
oh no, there's not been any such effort. So
okay.
Well, Daniel Lazar, who's an old ex-Trotskyist leftist, has written something where he's encouraged Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society, to disassociate itself from me because of my article, but that has not happened.
Okay. So at this point, Lazar stands alone in this demand.
Yes.
Okay, that's good to hear. Although it lowers the stakes of our conversation, I suppose. I'd like to be like you're, beleaguered by these mobs of baying lunatics who want to ruin you. But instead, what we actually saw was a lot of a surprising amount of coverage from sort of mainstream liberal press figures, including Jonathan Chait, and they, I suppose, used it as an example of something broader, which I think they largely claimed was sort of people just coming up with cockamamie justifications for whatever Trump is, whatever sort of nonsense he happens to be spouting out at any given moment, and sort of trying to, provide some kind of deeper rationale. So, but I think you do argue there is a deeper rationale at work in this Greenland proposal. And it also doesn't come out of nowhere. He did talk about it in his first term. Yes. And so, how do you understand the rationale?
Well, I mean, Trump's rationale is perhaps different from my own. My attitude about this is that, because he's raised it in his first administration, that this has some likelihood of taking place. And so what do we make of it? One leftist critic of mine said that this was said by Trump just to distract from the H-1B visa controversy among the incoming Trumpists. I don't think that that's the case. And it is connected to other things that I raised in my article, like him calling Canada the 51st state and Justin Trudeau the governor. As well as making, some demands regarding the Panama Canal. So I wanted to treat it all of a piece and really, look at it more philosophically. I do see Compact as publishing thought pieces. And certainly that's what I've published with you guys before. And I took that opportunity, basically structured around the question of, what is Greenland? What is Canada? What is America? What is the United States? Where do these things come from historically, and what do they represent, perhaps in an ongoing way? So I wasn't actually trying to be too provocative, but of course I did want to provoke some thinking.
So, there are a few things that have been brought up around this. One is this idea that Trump is reviving the Monroe Doctrine,
right?
Which associated with President James Monroe, which essentially rejected European interventions in the Western Hemisphere, which were happening, a decent amount in the 19th century. You had the famous attempt to install a Habsburg monarch on the throne of Mexico, which did happen for a few years and then led to a war.
Yes.
So interestingly, a young guy who's written for Compact named Antonio de Loera,
Hmm.
who is a union organizer, but also had some involvement in the Biden, had some role in the Biden administration, as a
Hmm.
staffer of some sort.
Hmm.
And an interesting guy, wrote about Jesse Jackson for us. But he had a kind of a nice post after the initial dust up about Greenland a few weeks ago,
Hmm.
where he was like, I hear the voice of Benito Juarez, right, who drives out, who's the Mexican national hero who drove out the Habsburgs,
Yes.
the sort of Habsburg pretender, sort
Yes.
of crying out against this, the fact that a large body of land in the Western Hemisphere is under the rule of a European monarch, right?
Right.
And that I think he was responding there to something you mentioned in the piece, which is that the King of Denmark, in response to Trump's initial remarks about this, added Greenland to his sort of coat of arms. And so I
Coat of
think
arms.
Antonio was kind of noting, how within this kind of broadly American hemispheric sort of liberal tradition, this idea that we will kick out the European monarchs is
That's right.
one way of understanding, or one thing you might understand this in continuity with, even if Trump himself doesn't put it that way.
That's right. Yeah. So, there are still some European territories and possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Martinique is an overseas department of France. Although, France had a revolution. And so, perhaps that claim isn't the same. So, I really wanted to take the opportunity to, mention Canada. And one of the reasons for this is, certainly for my generation, um, Europe and Canada, and I think still in an enduring way, they serve as uh, counterexamples to the United States. So the left in the United States wants to be more like Canada, more like Western European countries. And I've always been hostile to that perspective as a model. And so the social democratic welfare state of Europe and Canada as, progressive in comparison to the United States. And so the question is, again, why does Canada exist? And, in a way that's different from Greenland, Canada is perhaps the most European country in the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, their head of state still is King Charles. And so, that, certainly I was trying to provoke people, but provoke people to really consider, why do these, frontiers, political frontiers exist? What do they represent? Also, what do they represent in the imagination? Because I do think there's been an exaggerated response to the Greenland proposal, as a practicable proposal, as opposed to Canada, which seems less so, although not necessarily. A country that has the population of less than 1/10 of a U.S. congressional district, and that the U.S. already exerts a great deal of control over, already has a significant military base there. And so, why have people reacted so strongly to it? Of course, a lot of it is anti Trumpism, but also there is a deeper imagination. So, we might say that if Biden or Barack Obama had made a similar proposal, perhaps people would not have responded in the same way, but maybe they would have. In which case, why? And what is this kind of reflexive anti US imperialism? And, how do we understand the role of the US in the world? So, I also took the opportunity to sort of get underneath some of the assumptions about multipolarity and geopolitics, whose imagination, uh, you know, has been very compelling both on the left and on the right in recent years. Specter of US decline and what it means in terms of world politics. What do these things mean? How do we understand this in the long arc of history? And the long arc of history, you know, a lot of people on the left do expect China to replace the US as the dominant world power. I don't think that that's a very realistic prospect. But what are people imagining? How are they imagining it? That's what I was trying to sort of tease out.
So another thing that, and you mentioned this, is connected here is Trump's plans for, or at least feelings about NATO,
Yeah.
which and this is, I suppose, when I was talking to this about, or I was talking to some, I don't know, not exactly normie, but let's just say kind of
Mm-hmm.
average educated
Uh-huh.
New York City professionals about
Uh-huh.
this whole thing, and they were just like, what's the deal with this group? They're just thought it was kind of bizarre. Like they hadn't really seen the online freak out
Uh-huh.
about it, or read any of the columns about it, but they just kind of thought it was strange. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one thing I pointed out to them was, well, I mean, in effect, and this is perhaps why you wouldn't
Yeah.
hear this proposal from Barack Obama or Joe Biden, which is that,
Mm.
if NATO is the de facto U.S. empire,
Mm-hmm.
then that essentially means that Greenland kind of already does belong to us,
Belongs,
in
right.
effect. And so what Trump is doing here has more to do with, in a sense, his somewhat inchoate vision of a different form of American dominance, or at least
Perhaps.
power in the world. So one
Perhaps.
possible way to think about it is, well, if we're delinking from NATO, or no longer considering NATO
Right.
simply an extension of our power,
Right.
then the way we think about this territory, which is a
Mm-hmm.
crucial NATO asset, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the Arctic frontier, and the sort of opening up of all kinds of likely geopolitical competition
Nuclear
in that
defense going
region,
back to the Soviet era.
right? And that too. Um, and yeah, it's funny. This is random, but I always think about how when you fly across the Atlantic and you fly over like
You go up.
Newfoundland,
Yes. Yeah. That's
there's
right.
always this one, they on the map on the that you see on the back of the seat, you
Mm-hmm.
always see like these random places like Gander, Newfoundland,
Mm-hmm.
which but I mean the reason that's significant, actually, I think, and is in this kind of satellite GPS thing, is that it was another major
Base.
Cold War, going back to the Second World War, and then the Cold War
Yes.
sort of
That's right.
military base and Air Force base.
Right.
And so you all see Gander there. And so that whole arena has long had significance in geopolitical conflict, even if
So
we
let me
don't think
say a
about it that
couple of things
much.
about this. So I have an anecdote, which is that I went on my honeymoon to Iceland. So my husband and I were considering two different potential locations, Hawaii or Alaska. And, an Alaskan cruise or maybe a Hawaiian cruise. And then I came up with the idea, well, perhaps we'll do a combination of both, the land of fire and ice, Iceland. And it was quite spectacular place to visit. Very nice place. But the first thing that greeted us at the airport, getting off the plane, was a large contingent of American troops who probably outnumbered everyone else in the airport. Since it's a small airport, it's like a kind of analog to a regional airport in the United States. And I just thought, oh, I should have expected this, but I didn't quite expect this. Now, you mentioned Europe as already part of the American empire, but that would be a different meaning of empire, wouldn't it? Meaning they are allies, and the American president is the leader of the free world, and that means Europe and Japan. But when people think of American empire, they do think of the Western Hemisphere. They do think of Latin America. They think of countries that have been subordinated rather than allied with the United States. And the reason that I keyed into that is that, of course, this gets to the Empire of Liberty, meaning, has Europe joined the Empire of Liberty or not? Right? What does the US being the leader of the free world amount to regarding the Empire of Liberty? And especially nowadays, where we have a lot of evidence that Europe is lacking in certain civil liberties that we have in the United States, like freedom of speech, not to mention Second Amendment rights. But, also they don't really have Fourth Amendment rights the way we do. There's a whole host, there's a whole Bill of Rights, in fact. And, England is the closest to having the rights of Americans because a lot of the Bill of Rights descend from English law. But Starmer is presiding, is governing a country that is arresting people for social media posts, right? So again, the empire of liberty is in some question. What do we mean by it? Do we mean a voluntary association, allies, or do we mean forcible subjugation and subordination? And alliances are negotiated. And, the US did conquer Europe in World War II. And NATO, just, the commonplace phrase that people will invoke about NATO, that NATO was designed to keep the Russians out, to keep the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down. So, what does keeping the Americans in amount to? What does that mean? Politically, what is that about?
So I want to go to my own feelings about Greenland, which is that I actually have kind of thought this idea was pretty cool and exciting ever since I first heard about it, and it sort of inspired this kind of boyish excitement in me, even going back to the first time it was floated. And I suppose that's some sort of way that imagining this. I think the way I put it in a tweet was it's roughly the size of Mexico, but it has about the population of Hoboken.
Right,
So,
right.
imagining this unsettled land, this frontier, largely unsettled land. Interestingly, you note in the piece something about how the indigenous people of Greenland currently are actually arrived later than the Vikings,
The Inuit, yeah,
the Inuit. So, that's kind of an interesting fact as well, in
it
terms of all
is.
these discourses about indigeneity and so on. But
Yeah.
then there's also this land, that currently is locked in ice and thus, does not have an indigenous population. Right?
Mhm,
There's
mhm.
there can be no land acknowledgement there because no one, no one has ever been able to live on it. So I mean, there's something about that I suppose just kind of caught my fancy, and it does feel like a very American impulse to just think about this idea of the opening of a frontier as kind of exciting. Even though I don't know in practical terms what that would actually
What that
mean,
would
it's
mean.
still there's some sort of climactic shifts there that are probably going to unlock some of that ice sheet within the next few decades. But nonetheless, it's going to remain a pretty inhospitable place.
Right.
Um,
Oh, right.
but but I still just I think that was what initially struck me about it was that kind of sense that it captured my imagination.
Yeah,
um
sense of adventure. Don Jr., when he went, he said, I'm an outdoorsy guy. So, of course, I'm taking the opportunity to go to Greenland, right? Check it out, right? A place for a nice outdoor adventure hike, you know. Not sure how, how welcoming it is even on that level. Is it more like trying to climb Mount Everest? You know, it's pretty severe. I mean, Iceland is actually, by comparison, quite mild because of the Gulf Stream, but I'm not sure that Greenland benefits in that way. So but that was funny for me when Don Jr. said that. Like he kind of was like, "Oh yeah, I'm just checking it out. I'm just a tourist." You know.
so but I do wonder how this Empire of Liberty concept would connect or not to the frontier thesis, which I think if you look at people like Elon Musk, who and this is kind of what I would connect it to, and his sort of broader base of like fans and people who people who've been into him long
Mhm.
before he got involved with Trump, basically
Mhm.
because they believed in his ideas about terraforming Mars and stuff like that, which I
Right.
also can't help but find some appeal in, to be honest.
Mhm.
Uh, so, and actually, I have a long-standing argument with like a very old friend where we'll get into fights about whether colonizing Mars is a good idea or not. He thinks
Right.
not. I think so. But there is this kind of notion of the frontier spirit, and Frederick Jackson Turner and this idea that, I think it comes up in Ross Douthat's Decadent Society, that sort of, one of the only ways to perhaps counteract America's increasing decadence is to, reopen the frontier in some way, whether it's space or somewhere
Mm-hmm,
else. And
mm-hmm.
so, I think there's that kind of aspect of it. And then I wonder how that connects, if at all, to this Empire of Liberty notion that you take from Jefferson and
Right.
reference heavily in the piece.
Right. So it's unclear whether Jefferson really meant expansionism exactly. And, so when we think of empire, when we think of imperialism, we think of territorial expansion, we think of conquest. And, Jefferson could be blamed for the first imperialist expansion of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase. I don't think that that's a good understanding of that. Um, and nonetheless, so there's the external frontier. There's also the sort of internal frontier idea of liberty, meaning, could we transform America? Could we treat it as um, a space open for renewal? Does it have to be literally new space? Or can we remake our space? One of the things that I also was thinking about with Greenland in particular, but also Canada, I recalled the opening of the Canadian tar sands as a new site for oil extraction, and the invention of new technology that made it possible to extract oil in a way that had not been the case before. And that's connected up with other things like the Keystone Pipeline, which Trump encouraged, protested at Standing Rock under Obama. Trump opened it, Biden closed it again. There's also ANWR in Alaska, and Seward's Folly, which is obliquely mentioned in the article. So, I talk about Seward acquiring Alaska, but also Trump's folly. In other words, is this going to be, people treat it as a folly, but maybe actually it will have repercussions down the road. So, there are different ways of thinking about it. It's not just in terms of, natural frontier, the sort of beauty of open space that is associated with the United States. But also, from Trump's perspective, and again, as a Marxist, I had to consider, what do I think of frontiers for business, frontiers for capitalist exploitation? How do we even think about that? Because I think that that's the other assumption. The other assumption is that the U.S. will violate Greenland in a way that the Danes don't currently. And that would not be terribly accurate. And just at a very mundane level, that the EU might have stronger environmental protections than the United States does in terms of protecting Greenland. But maybe the people of Greenland want and need new opportunities that the EU regulations prevent. I will also say about the Inuit, what I learned after writing and publishing the article was that actually there are Inuit who end up indigent in Denmark. And they do have like a human development index that's very low, like many other Native Americans, sort of tragically. And so again, what are we to make of that, right? Like, might there be opportunities opened in Greenland that are not the case now? So everything that we associate with the suffering of Native Americans is the case under Danish rule. So,
Which, as I understand it, also involves sort of heavy subsidies. It's actually a kind of losing, it's a money losing operation for Denmark. It's
might be for
which
the
I
U.S.
mean,
as well.
right, and I was pointing this out the other day, that people often think that empire is some kind of hyper efficient way for powerful countries to just kind of suck up the
Hmm.
resources. But in fact, it's often like this, right? That empire becomes a net drain.
Costly.
The colonies are actually very costly to maintain, and they often collapse because the government just simply can't afford it anymore. And so, yeah, I think that's often I mean, I suppose that moves us to another point, which is the left's. I mean, I
Mhm.
think the liberal sort of mainstream responses to your piece were mostly just caught in a somewhat uninteresting kind of Trump derangement where,
Yeah.
they just, whatever he or anybody who's willing to take his ideas seriously said, they just say they just denounce. And, they also are, it's kind of hilarious because many of them were themselves like cheerleaders of various wars and invasions, but then they're
I
like,
was shocked but
aha.
not surprised to learn that Jonathan Chait had been a cheerleader for the Iraq War. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
because I mean, believe it or not, even though Jonathan Chait is quite a prominent writer, I recognized the name but was unfamiliar with him. With his politics. So, I don't know the deep background in that sense. But yeah, imperialism, I mean, you mentioned something that's actually important, which is we've naturalized decolonization after World War II. But in large measure, it had to do with the fact that these countries just couldn't maintain it anymore. And so, I will rather, again, provocatively say that the old colonial countries, the colonizers, cut and ran. They sort of abandoned their colonies. And France, of course, still demands payment for the costs of colonization from West African nations, which I just think, how did they get away with that? And so, when we think of uh, history that we take for granted now, it wasn't necessarily so, and it's bound up with other developments. Similarly, when we think of like the European welfare states, we have to remember that they come out of the need to rebuild after the devastation of World War II, that they are not generous so much as they are austerity measures because capitalism couldn't do the trick. And so the kind of new social democratic um, desires on the part of the American left are inseparable from the financial crisis and really inseparable from an austerity perspective, which of course Trump rejects. Right. So I think that that's the other kind of cognitive dissonance that people have, is that there's a fundamental disbelief that American capitalism can recover. And that's why I mentioned in my article, well, look, not only are American citizens, people living in the United States, dependent on capitalist recovery here, but the rest of the world is too, including the great rival China. They actually depend on American recovery. And so, what is it that people are wishing for when they have this militant disbelief that that's even possible?
Yeah, and I mean, you see this from different parts of the political spectrum. I think there's actually quite a bit of debate on the right, about whether America is in some kind of terminal decline. And you even see within the MAGA camp, there's sort of
Mm-hmm.
a, a, a split, which isn't always fully articulated. But I think between people who really have a kind of declinist mindset and sort of see their goal as to mitigate
Retrenchment.
that, or and
Mm-hmm.
retrench. And then you have sort of the opposite, which is the reemergence of these much more kind of ambitious
Mm-hmm.
expansionist ideas, even if they're not necessarily all that well laid out in terms
25
of
new
like
cities.
policy plans. Yeah, right,
25 new
exactly.
cities, right? Trump Town.
Right.
Um, you know, I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk and Mars. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Total Recall, right? What's the image that we have in the popular culture of the colonization of Mars? We also have The Martian, right? So both pretty bleak. you know, one more playfully and one more dire. But I'm not sure. Like, so again, I can imagine that leftists are like, oh my god, Mars will be this libertarian hell in which you have to pay for oxygen, right? Where you're living in a company town, from the old Gilded Age. And I'm sure that people imagine that that's what these Trump towns would be. They'd be model cities for a kind of neoliberal hell.
Yeah, and if you read the sort of more fantastical visions of some on the kind of libertarian tech right, they do
But
basically
still wanted to make
propose these kind
artificial
of
islands,
the
right?
seasteading, and so they do actually propose this kind of stuff. And they describe it as uh, a sort of in their version, kind of utopian prospect, but it
Yeah.
is quite reminiscent of these sort of Philip K. Dick visions of
Stories.
Mars and so on.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but
No
but
utopia can be separated from dystopia, I
right,
would say, in
yeah,
capitalism.
sure.
Meaning that, and the future will be neither the utopia nor the dystopia that people imagine. It will be something both better and worse than we can imagine. That's the way it's
I
gone so far.
I almost want to end it there, but I did also kind of want to get back to Canada and
Right.
perhaps also the Panama Canal, which is maybe a whole opens up a whole other set of issues,
It
which
might.
kind of have to do with this sort of prior phase of empire in which, as you said, America kind of intervenes and meddles quite aggressively in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and builds the Panama Canal. I still remember this Trump. There was some Trump interview where he kept talking about the mosquito, and not
Yeah, how many
mosquitoes,
people
but the
died
mosquito. We lost many men to the mosquito.
to the mosquito, right?
Yeah, and it was just one of these great things where you could tell it's something he just thought about obsessively. One of these things he'd
It's a
fixated
grim
on.
image, we have to
Yeah,
admit,
yeah,
right? We
yeah.
have to admit, like, being killed by a mosquito is a pretty grim prospect.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people don't remember enough what building the Panama Canal involved. It's no joke, but I mean, there's something interesting in that. The canals as kind of the crucial,
Image.
and having spent a good amount of time in Latin America, it's also
Uh-huh.
true that the Chinese economic presence
Yeah.
there is very significant, and
Yes.
it is actually a major arena where I mean, he's right to sense that there's something to be concerned about there, perhaps,
Something amiss.
because and it's I believe that China also spoke to or was in talks with Nicaragua about building another canal across
Yes.
Nicaragua.
Yes, that's right.
Um, but I think it proved impracticable for the moment. But
Mhm, mhm.
so there this is a kind of it's another arena of, I'd say, escalating geopolitical competition, another kind of great game scenario perhaps.
It's unclear
But
what the real significance of all that is. So I do recall also with Brazil, Bolsonaro and Lula, right? The stakes of that election had to do with China's presence in Brazil, right? And you know, I think that there are obviously tactical differences with regard to different politicians and how they might approach handling the relations with China. But the US does not necessarily have a net loss with regard to Chinese economic development, including abroad, right? So I've, you know, been somewhat impressed by an analysis by Yanis Varoufakis regarding how China fits into the American led capitalist world order rather than being an alternative to it, right? And how, so when people talk about, currencies and, like China lending money to the developing world, that can also suit the United States very well, meaning to have China absorb some of the risk involved in trying to develop, uh, poorer countries, whether in Africa or Latin America. And, so it doesn't, I don't think that it has to mean a net loss for the United States or a net gain or benefit for China just in that simple way. And again, this is going to sound like the rising tide that lifts all boats that we're supposed to disparage as neoliberal claptrap. But of course, there's some truth to it.
well, this sort of gets to, and perhaps this is a place to close it off because it's kind of a big question, but it strikes me that what you're articulating is sort of precisely what Trump has rejected, at least in his understanding of trade and economics. That he has this kind of aggressively zero sum vision where if something pops up in China, that means it's not popping up in America. So if China gets some share of something, that's something taken away from us. So there isn't really a sense in his basic vision, and this is why he thinks all tariffs are always good, right?
Right.
Because
Or he plays
um,
it that way. I think that
yeah,
we'd have to be careful because it is the case, I think. It's not just an apologetics or a deflection to say that for Trump, tariffs are a negotiating tool. Jamie
sure.
Dimon came out and said, that he sees Trump's vision of tariffs as a negotiating tool rather than a new state of affairs. And, Trump also says that he's very proud of his renegotiated trade deal with China, that he did bill as mutually advantageous, but he says COVID ruined it, right? And ruined it both in terms of, the Chinese origin of the COVID virus, but also ruined it at a more basic level, which is that COVID disrupted international trade. In other words, it sort of reset the landscape. And so things need to be renegotiated now. He invited Xi to the inauguration. What was that about? I don't think that was about kissing the ring. I think it was about, you know, can we respect each other? Right? Can you respect my reelection? Can you respect that you have to deal with me now? Especially because I think the Republicans have made the argument quite credibly that the Chinese showed a great deal of disrespect to the Biden administration by comparison.
Yeah. So it sounds like, I mean, going back to my zero sum point, it sounds like, and your examples are convincing that there's sort of a distinction between his zero sum rhetoric, which ties into his negotiation tactics, and his actual behavior, including, I don't know, I mean, renegotiating NAFTA, of course, being quite
Yep.
significant, and
Hmm.
being something that actually, we covered this, but that Mexico under AMLO sort of thought they could get a better deal out of too, and seemed to have been satisfied with that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, that's an interesting point. Um, in terms of, I guess then there's sort of the geopolitical, geostrategic end of it, which is how, again, kind of going back to the NATO point.
Hmm. Hmm.
I guess one of the things I found weirdest about the left's freak out about your article was sort of that it ultimately is just a sort of or it's further a further indication of their pro NATO position, right? That
Ironically
they
enough,
actually want to preserve the NATO order, as far as I can tell.
seemingly.
Um, and so,
I
you know,
remember when NATO was like, Operation Gladio, where NATO really had a very bad reputation. I think that Jacobin released last year a video that was about how the three Cold War regional security arrangements designed by the United States, of those three, only one was left standing because CETO was destroyed by Vietnam and the Iranian Revolution destroyed CENTO. I'm not sure that the latter is really something to celebrate, the Islamic Revolution, but whatever. And I think that there was some equivocation with regard to, like, is the Ukraine war going to break NATO, right? But the idea was NATO's the last man standing and it should fall, right? And it was in the context of this new Ukraine war, of the last few years. And so it was remarkable because I think there's a deep ambivalence about these things. And again, NATO is not only to subordinate Europe to American strategic needs, but is also um, to obligate the U.S. to defend Europe. And that's, again, it's not that, because people are speculating in all sorts of directions rather wildly, which is, oh, does Trump have a continental perspective? Is he retreating not to American isolationism, but to a continental vision of, or a hemispheric vision of security? I don't think this is necessarily so. You know, I think that rather he just wants to reset the terms of NATO. And NATO is an officially recognized United Nations security force, meaning NATO is in Afghanistan. How does that make sense? That's not the North Atlantic, right? I mean, I guess it came out of mutual defense. The U.S. was attacked, etc. But was the U.S. attacked by the Afghanistan government? No, you know. So it does raise the question of what are the purposes of these arrangements, and they're not just directly military alliances. Meaning, NATO also means the sharing of weapons technology, for instance, and cooperation in the production of such technology. So I think that uh, we shouldn't forget that the NATO countries are arms exporters. They don't just produce arms for their own defense. And in that way, they're in competition with China and Russia as weapons producers as well. So again, I don't think that Trump's going to throw all that away by any means. Why would he?
So you end by invoking his seeing the need for a broader American future. So if it isn't that, then what do you think that future is?
Well, I mean, I think that American capitalism will rebound. I think that there are deep inner resources, and I leaned on the political aspect, which is to say, what do we make of the billionaires joining Trump's second term? Well, it's just the simple fact that there are these other sources of power in the United States. And so there are sources of economic power in the United States that are not at all exhausted. And so, there is going to be a change. And that's where clearly the mood of pessimism, because I think that that's also people rejected Biden and Harris out of a disgust with their policies and also just with their fecklessness. I mean, really, if the policies had worked, it would have been a different story. But the fecklessness is remarkable. But there's also a tone of pessimism to the Democrats, and it goes all the way back to 2016. It's "Make America Great Again" versus "America is great already." The complacency of that is also something that is being rejected. So the left sees kind of a nightmare of this kind of dystopian future under Trump, and they neglect the fact that it's optimism that Trump represents. And I think that they really are rejecting that. They wouldn't put it exactly that way, but if you press them on it, they would say, no, we don't want to drill, baby, drill. We don't want to open up new frontiers of resource extraction. No, we don't want to increase the consumption of the American working class. We don't, right? Um, we want to provide them with more human services, but not with physical goods, right? Remember infrastructure? It's like human infrastructure. Physical infrastructure is such a guy thing. Only men think about like bridges and roads, right? What about childcare? And I just think that no, people are not enthusiastic about what the Democrats have to offer in terms of a vision of the future, which is a kind of ethical austerity. Whereas Trump, it might be unbridled capitalism, which might mean irresponsible prosperity. I mean, he is a kind of 80s guy. He is. That was when he was in his prime, and then he started angling in a political direction as he got older. You know, he thought that the politicians were ruining American prospects unnecessarily, that they were squandering potential.
Just like he saw in Midtown Manhattan in the 70s, that he's
Right, right.
nobody believed it was going to come back, but he believed.
That's right. Exactly.
So
So, I just think, again, it's certainly my generation on the left, but also the millennials and now the Zoomers are so deeply affected by pessimism that it's actually unrealistic. It's not the way it's going to go, actually. And thank God.
good place to leave it. Thanks, Chris.
Cool. Thanks,
Pleasure to
Jeff.
talk. Thanks for the article. And thanks, listeners. If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review us. And check us out at compactmag.com. Chris's piece, which appeared on January 9th, is called The Future Belongs to America, So Should Greenland. So provocative, controversial. You can read the various responses to it by just, Googling, I imagine. And it was quite an interesting reaction.
Indeed. Indeed.
All right. Thanks again.